You know, I've been around for 30 years at NC State, and I've tested all kinds of products. And there's a few things over my career that I think were really good value for the grower that have lasted. And I really think this is an idea that has the potential for being one of those few things that's a great idea for the grower and lasts. What I'd really like to do today is sort of describe some of the scenarios where I think this type of technology really fits. You know, one of the things that I oftentimes talk about is we need to get nutrients into the plant. We're good at getting them into the soil. We're good at trying to get enough of them there so these roots can go find it. It's getting them through that root membrane and into the plant that really I want to focus on. I talked to a lot of meetings here over the last 2 months, and I certainly was over here in Perquimans County not too long ago, and I mentioned this concept. This is one of the things that I've focused on for the last 3 years, is this positive feedback loop. And what that is that the moment that root comes out of that seed coat, it encounters nutrients, absorbs those nutrients, and that causes more cell division, more root growth, to the point that we get this rapid early growth cycle in this plant and makes a difference. So here's this field I've been showing. This has actually been in Wayne County on a sandy loam soil. But I show the difference between these green plots here that we've got and this yellow corn in between. There's no difference in planting date here, no difference in the hybrid that we're using, no difference in actually the total amount of nutrients we applied here. The difference was in how we applied nutrients. In this case, we put them on, broadcast them over the surface, such that it took them time to work into the soil so that that root could find them. Whereas these were banded right beside the root in a position where that plant immediately found that nutrient and got off to that rapid start. The point I'm making with this slide in context with this material is how important it is to get these nutrients in the root as quickly as possible to get these, and that's the difference in growth in the amount of nitrogen that's been taken up here. Now, as I said at many meetings, there's many ways or many tools that we've tested over the years to try to make this positive feedback loop happen. One of them is just good weather, planting it in the right conditions, so you got 60-degree average temperatures. That's what 40 or 50 growing degree units are. 60-degree average temperatures over the next 4 days after the seed goes in the ground. And the other factor is moisture. Oftentimes our problem at planting time is not too little moisture. In fact, I often think that we'd be better off planting in the drier soils. It's too much. When we get 2 inches of rain or more within that first 7 days, we get saturated conditions around the seed. That prevents that seed from taking in those nutrients. Even though they may be present there, that seed has not got the energy to drive that nutrient acquisition. So here are some other tools when we don't have good weather, because of course that'd be great if our planting seasons were as such that we could plant under good conditions every year, but we don't always have that. So we have to have other ways to help this. One of my tools is phosphorus index above 40. Now I think that's actually the minimum. You know, when you look at your phosphorus index, where is that phosphorus? Is it in the upper 4 inches, upper 2 inches where the seed is, or is it down in the lower 4 inches of that 8-inch core that you took? Too often, it's lower in that core, and therefore we don't have enough phosphorus. Why do I need so much phosphorus? Because I have to have a high enough concentration on the outside of that little root to drive it in. Those roots use a process called ion exchange to get phosphorus in. That's our common process for getting phosphorus out of the soil through the root membrane into the root. It requires energy. That plant has to be growing. It has to be expelling these protons, these points of energy, so that it can take phosphorus across that root membrane. And oftentimes when it's cool or wet, we're not growing very rapid, that root's not expelling enough protons, we're not drawing in very much phosphorus. So I got to get a high enough concentration out there that when it does send out a proton, it finds immediately a phosphate molecule to draw into that root. So that's part of the tool. Micronutrients have to be available. A lot of us have a lot of phosphorus in our soils, so I got the concentration. The problem is the balance. I need 30 parts of phosphorus for every 1 part of zinc. 30 pounds of phosphorus for every 1 pound of zinc in my soil. Otherwise, I don't have enough zinc to utilize the phosphorus. I may draw it into the root, but I don't have enough zinc to utilize it once it gets into the plant itself. Another tool is, do I have nitrogen? I've been saying this over and over. I need 1/3 of my nitrogen. So if I'm looking at a 150 bushel corn crop, I'm at least got 50 pounds of nitrogen that I need to apply at planting. Why do I need all that nitrogen at planting time? Again, I have to have high enough concentrations in the soil so that I could drive that nitrogen into the root. Nitrogen comes into the root through diffusion, which means the diffusion is driven by concentration. The higher the concentrate, it moves from high levels of concentration to lower. So I have to have a high enough concentration on the outside of the root to drive it into that root tissue itself, diffusing through the epidermal cells of the root. So these are some of the tools that we've used. Let me just show you how they worked this last year. I'm laying the groundwork for what we're going to see as we look at this material here. So here's weather. Each of those dots here represents a day in which I've calculated the number of growing degree units in the next 4 days following that planting opportunity. So where you see the scale here, there's a dot there that's about 45. There's another one over 80. This is for this area's weather. And you can see here where we had good temperature conditions and, for that matter, good soil moisture conditions where we needed to plant corn. Here's one opportunity here. Here's another opportunity later in May. So one of the things I pointed out at the meeting earlier is, where did the guys who grew 300 bushel corn last year, and we had 10 of them in North Carolina, where did they plant this crop? Well, no big surprise. There's where these yield contest entries came from, April 12th through April 20th, May 5th through the May 10th. Ideal planting environment. So indeed, they put their seed in a position where it could rapidly acquire nutrients, got it off to that rapid start, got the big root system under it, so that they could transpire water and support those kind of yields. I'm going to show you a couple of trials where we planted corn to see how some of these tools work that I just described here. Wayne County, Terrell County, I think, are the two that I'm going to point out here. Terrell County planted on the 22nd of April, just before this temperature dropped here. We did get some rain. In fact, in Terrell County, we had 1.5 inches of rain 3 days after we planted, and another 2.5 inches 2 days after that. So it's plenty wet. So here's what Terrell County looked like. Here's the no starter treatment. There's my tool. I didn't have the right environment, so I'm trying to see what I could do to stimulate growth here with my tools. So I'm using starter. So there's no starter treatment there in these 4 rows. You can see I can see down the rows pretty easily. It's a little yellow. Here's where I put some starter, 622-6 with a little zinc there. There's those 4 rows, and you can actually see how tall they are compared to the plots on each side there. Indeed, you can see the difference here that a little starter made in helping get this positive feedback loop established and get that extra growth and leaf area that we need to set good yield potential. And of course, what's happening above ground is indicative of what's happening below ground with that root system. The interesting thing here is, if you look at this, 204 bushels versus 226 bushel, why, that starter paid for itself there, even though it's fairly costly, and I'm using, in some cases, a lot of it. 1027-0, there's that treatment there at 20 gallons to the acre. That's a last year it was an $80 treatment. This year it's $70 treatment. That's a lot of money to put at risk just in hopes that I'll get better growth. This is our problem. This is, by the way, the problem with starter fertilizer. It's been the problem since I started testing it 15, 20 years ago. In order to get consistent results, I have to go with enough of it to overwhelm that soil situation. So I could try 10 gallons, but sometimes it works great, sometimes it doesn't in abandon. Same thing in in-furrow. I could go to 3 gallons. Sometimes I get really good results, sometimes I not. So over the years, how have I compensated to try to make it more consistent? I've increased the amount of fertilizer in that starter formulation, 20 gallons rather than 10 in a banded application, or 5 versus 3 in an in-furrow. And why is that true? It's because it's there. I've got plenty in both cases. 10 or 20 gallons, 3 or 5 gallons, I got plenty. I can't get it in the root every time. The root may be growing so slowly, we may not have enough energy to move that phosphate into that root. It becomes a matter of getting the environment and the starter to work together. That's been my problem. So indeed, when I need that nutrient, yeah, I could even pay for 20 gallons of starter fertilizer when I get that's a 22 bushel yield increase in Terrell County last year. Here's another case of where nutrients became important last year. Now this was Wayne County. If I go back here and look at where Wayne was planted, it was planted about the 17th of April, actually under really good conditions. So you would have thought, well, I don't need so much starter there. But in point of fact, there's where my starter even made a bigger impact in my yield outcome, and that is because my nutrient concentrations are poor at this location. This is a field that's been reclaimed from some housing developments around it. We reclaimed it for use as a field plot research, so the nutrient contents in this field were low. So indeed, I needed to put something there to help this feedback loop get started. So you can see whether I was on the better soil in that field, where that rains has a little more organic matter. There I went from 197 to 233, or on that weaker soil, that Norfolk sandy loam, 134 to 185. Yeah, it didn't take you don't need to do your math to figure out that was easily made money doing that. Now, I've shown you two examples where using nutrients helped me increase yield in a early growth situation, get that positive feedback loop established. But as I already have mentioned, there are plenty of situations over the years where I've got this kind of response. Here in Pamlico County, this actually was in 2022. I had ideal planting conditions. The soil conditions were pretty good, so I got plenty of nutrients, in other words, what I'm trying to say there. And you can see the check was 233. Yeah, I made a little difference, 240, that's 7 bushels. But under that situation, I can't pay for $70 worth of fertilizer. I'm spending a lot of money without a lot of return on that investment for that money. There, in fact, there it is. I've lost $19.54 an acre. This is our problem with starter. This is our problem with the kind of volume of starter we got to have to get consistent results. When it works, it's great. I'm making money. When it doesn't work, when I don't need it, when the environment and the soil work in tandem with each other, I'm losing money. So how can I solve this problem? How can I make starter work so that I can rely on getting investment return every time? Well, here's where that big word Jim just used earlier, comes in. Endocytosis. You know, when I went through graduate school, this is 40 years ago now, I heard this word, endocytosis, because that's another way of getting things into the plant root. You see here diffusion. I've talked about diffusion. That's how nitrogen enters the plant root. It just diffuses through this root membrane. I talked about ion transport in the case of phosphorus. You have to have an ion, in this case a proton, a hydrogen proton, has to be expelled through the root into the soil, opening the channel for phosphate to move in. Those are our common ways that we've had nutrients moving into the plant. But there is a third. Now, you've seen endocytosis in your lifetime. Have you ever seen a tree grow around a barbed wire fence such that it encompassed the barbed wire in the tree? That's a form, a gross form of endocytosis. Endocytosis has a lot of benefits in that you could, as I mentioned, you can load more materials through the membrane than you can through diffusion or ion transport. what's the problem with endocytosis? Why don't we use it before? Why haven't we always used it? The problem is you have to have the right size molecule with the right charge nature. And those molecules have to be consistent. That root will not accept just any size particle. It has to be a certain size particle. And in the past, we haven't been able to have the technology to manufacture particles of a consistent size that would actually work in endocytosis. So here's what happens when you get new ideas and new technology that comes in this form. We have now the availability of using this form of moving nutrients into the plant. It has a lot of benefits. I don't need energy. I don't need that plant to extrude a proton. I think it's a more readily accessible way of moving large amounts of molecules into the plant very quickly. So there's some real benefits to endocytosis. I think he's already mentioned you're loading these particles up with some nutrient molecules and they go into that plant here. So how did endocytosis? Now, I'm just like you. This is the first year I've looked at this material. First I'd heard of it was this last spring. And so we're still learning. There's lots of ways I think we can learn to use this that's got some benefits. Now, we need to fix some of my approaches here, but I think we got a potential for using this to do a lot of good with lower amounts of nutrients. So here was a test we did. This was on corn down in Washington County there. This shows where these plots were. We had several treatments here. We had the 1027-0. So I'm banding the nutrients. I'm just adding these nanoparticles to it. So in 1027-0 with the Nano CS, 1027-0 with the Nano N+, 1027-0 all by itself. Each of these is at 20 gallons. So all of these have the same amount of 1027-0. And then I also have this treatment with the Nano Pro added to Veltima and Brigade applied at B12. Now this was a treatment really designed for stink bug control, not for starter, but for stink bug control. So the question you got to start here is, well, where's my check? What's my check treatments here? Well, there's a couple things that I want you to look and compare. First of all, as far as no starter, well, that no starter is this one right here. I did not apply starter to this one with the Nano Pro, Veltima, and Brigade. So that's 242.6 bushels to the acre. Now this was good soil. This was a lot like what I just showed you in 2022 at Pamlico County. High nutrient levels. This farmer is very progressive. He's using a lot of soil test information. He's got high levels of nutrients in his soil. We planted in pretty good conditions. There's April 20th. So again, like Pamlico County, I would have thought, well, gee, I spent a bunch of money on 20 gallons of 1027 and didn't get much. And indeed, that's the case here. Take a look. There's just the 20 gallons of 1027-0. There's 242.4. Almost identical yield. That slug of fertilizer did not do a daggone thing for me, because that soil, that environment, we were getting as much nutrients into the root as diffusion and ion exchange would allow us to do. So what happened then if we added these nanoparticles? Well, here you see we went to 254.8 with the Nano N+, which is supposed to be designed to load up with most of these nutrients that we really worried about that I just mentioned, phosphorus, nitrogen, zinc, boron, to get in the plant. So how did I get from 242 to 254.8 in a good environment when I clearly have plenty of nutrients in my soil? I got them into the root. I got them through the root membrane and into the root through endocytosis, resulting in even more early growth and better yield potential. So there's a good difference there. The Nano CS, that's 249.6. Again, not as good as the Nano M+, but still shows that promise of using endocytosis. Guys, if you calculate, by the way, if you calculate the returns here, I still didn't make money here, even though the Nano stuff was about $3 an acre. By 20 gallons of 1027-0, I'm spending still too much money. But here's where the promise is. I didn't need that much here. If I could just use 5 gallons or 10 with the Nano and gotten that response, now I'm making money more consistently with this approach. So that's the promise I think endocytosis has for us here, is being able to load these molecules with smaller amounts of fertilizer, get it into the root, and utilize this idea of a positive feedback loop in all circumstances.
Dr. Heiniger,
Yes.
you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that I've been communicating to people based on just what farmers are saying and telling me, but now that you've done the research, I'll see if you agree.
Okay.
So with corn prices being what they are this year,
Right.
a lot of guys still go out and side dress.
Right.
Say they're side dressing 40 gallons of liquid nitrogen.
Right.
And they don't want to spend any more money this year.
Yeah. No, you can't.
You can back off 2 or 3 gallons of liquid nitrogen to account for the cost of Nano-N.
Right. Yeah.
He's spending the same amount of money. Would you think 37 gallons with Nano-N is going to be just as good as, if not better than 40 gallons without it?
Right. I would say it's going to easily be better because you're getting the N into the root better. You're transporting across the one barrier that we've had hard time breaching, and that's that root barrier. Being able to just get that material in. 37 versus 40, shoot, I think you can get away with 30 versus 40 gallons in these cases. That's the thing that I say, we're going to learn a lot more in the next year or two about how efficient we can do using this endocytosis approach. So, you bet. So indeed, here you can see 1027 alone. If I had dropped that 1027 at just 10 gallons, I easily would have made money using the Nano coat. So indeed, or the Nano N+. So indeed, you can see the potential that I have here. Now this is important for us this year. If there's ever a year to try a product, this is going to be it. And that's really the bottom line. It's always been the bottom. Every product I've ever tested and talked about, it's you who do the real measurement and the evaluation on your farm. So this is a year to do that. It's an El Nino year. There's the hot water over the Pacific here. I've been talking about this. It's going to have a tendency to bring cooler conditions here and wetter weather for this springtime planting opportunity. So here's the last El Nino year. You can see here we didn't have that many good planting days, and when we did, it was raining. That's typical El Nino spring. So we're going to need this fertilizer to help us get this crop out. Here's an opportunity to utilize this technology and test it for yourself side by side with your regular rate of starter or other techniques, whatever you may be using. So indeed, I think there's a great deal of promise from what I've seen so far. Yeah, we had one trial. Yeah, we were in the ideal condition. We need to put it under more trials, test it under less than ideal nutrient conditions, see where it can go. But when you can see that kind of yield response in that environment by being able to use endocytosis, that really gives me hope that we got a technology we can finally use to get these roots to take up nutrients better. All right, now let me talk about the other application that we tested and the promise I think that holds. Soybeans. How do you get higher yield soybeans? You know, what does it take? What are some of the foundation principles of getting high soybean yields? Well, one of the foundational principles is we need more pods per node. You know, typically what? You get 2 or 3 pods on a node on your soybean plant? That's very common. Right there she is. That's very common. That's what, a 40 bushel soybean crop? Yeah, if you get lucky, you got enough nodes, maybe 45 or 50. What should we look at if we want even more? This plant here has 4 to 5 nodes or pods per node. There's a 60 to 80 bushel soybean crop right there. And if you go back and remember old Kip Cullers, he had 10 to 12 pods per node. The guy in Georgia who raised 200 bushel soybeans, I understand every single node had 15 pods on each of those nodes. So that is how we make high yield soybeans. Is you put more pods on those nodes, they're loaded up to the gills. So how do we do this? How can we achieve what that guy in Georgia achieved here? Well, there's two things you have to do. First of all, it's light. Each of those nodes has to have an abundant supply of photosynthetic material that comes from light. That light is the light that's hitting these trifoliate leaves that are attached directly to that node. So it's a matter of each of those trifoliate leaves being able to function at their maximum level to provide the energy needed for that node to put that many pods on. Now you know this to be true. When you get soybeans chest high and you think, oh, wow, I did a really good job of getting that soybean off to a good start. Well, the problem is you don't have any pods at the bottom because the light didn't get down there. It didn't shine on these trifoliates, and they didn't produce any photosynthesis, and you had no pods then. So you know this factor of having light at each of these nodes is critical. So leaf health is important here. That's why fungicides often have worked. Jim Dunphy showed that fungicides had an increase in yield. Rachel Vann has shown that fungicides applied after R1 have improved yield. It's light. It's improving light efficiency of that leaf. The second factor, and the one that I think is really the hardest to achieve, is nutrients. That plant has to have abundant amount of nutrients to support that kind of pod load level. The soybean plant actually needs more nitrogen than corn plant. It just makes a lot of its own nitrogen. It's the same for other nutrients. It uses more nutrients actually per bushel than corn does. So when are nutrients needed? Well, they're needed right when the pods are being formed. So each of these lines represents R1. That's the beginning of bloom. And you can see how rapidly these nutrients are being taken into the plant. Every day, pound after pound of nutrient has to be transported into that plant, either through the roots or through some other method. And you can see that that's true for everything. Nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, every single root nutrient is the same. So we have tried over the years, and you have too, I'm sure, at one time or another in a soybean field, to broadcast or foliar apply nutrients, haven't you? Now, how often has that worked for you? Well, I hope it's worked for you better than it's worked for me. It ain't worked very often for me. The problem that we have, both from the standpoint of nutrients as well as fungicides, is getting them into the leaf. Soybean leaf is highly impermeable to nutrients. So how can we overcome this barrier of moving nutrients directly into the leaf in a foliar application and provide this foundation for better soybean yields? Well, I try. Here's just an example. I'm just showing you a study we did. There's check, no treatment. That's good soybean, 75 bushel. We put 30 pounds of nitrogen. Now that we put it on the soil, we did get a little more yield there. That's hard to do. And then there's fungicide. We did make about 6 bushel more on fungicide. It's just, some years I could get a little response. Some years I can't get nothing out of either the fungicide or nutrient application. So here's what we did with this nanoparticle. Because endocytosis works the same on the leaf, quite frankly, it works just as well on a stem if you could put it there. Same on a leaf as it does with the root. The leaf will actually open to allow that particle into the leaf, carrying with it whatever load of material it has on that particle. So here's a soybean trial. We did this last year. Now it's hard to see these names. There's the check here. The first treatment's check, 55.8 bushels. The next two treatments are fungicides applied at R1. Lucento at 5 ounces and Miravis Neo at 13.7 ounces. There's my fungicide effect, 59.7, 57.6. I didn't pay for many fungicide applications doing that kind of stuff. This is typically what I see. Now these soybeans were planted on time. This is May 15th, I think, May 12th to the 15th when we planted these soybeans. So they were in good shape. Now there was no disease on these soybeans. You could sort of see that by looking at the aerial photograph. So perhaps it isn't surprising I didn't get much out of the fungicide. But here's the two treatments where we added the Nano. There's Nano Pro with Delaro. Delaro is at 8 ounces. And Nano FE with Delaro again at 8 ounces again, applied at the same time that we applied these other fungicide-only treatments. Now we're up to 66.9 bushels and 64.6 bushels, a significant increase in yield. And all we're doing there, this isn't even nutrients. All I'm doing here is driving that fungicide into the plant and making it more effective, long-term, increasing that leaf health in this field. So indeed, this I think we're going to use this technology this coming year with nutrients to see if indeed foliar application nutrients at R1 to R3 can make a big difference in soybean yield by setting extra pods. If you want to say, well, gee, Doc, you didn't really compare apples to apples. That's Delaro, that's Lucento and Miravis Neo. Well, we had a trial right next to it in which we had Delaro with Miravis and Lucento and Xyway and Top Guard, all of those. And you can see here that Delaro didn't make any more difference than Lucento did. In fact, Lucento beat Delaro there. And Xyway actually was the only one that was significant. And of course, we put that on at planting time. So there's a good example of apples to apples as far as what fungicide worked or what didn't work in this application. So indeed, here's another opportunity where I see that this endocytosis can be used by us to make a difference in our management into the future. So indeed, we got to improve pod retention here. We use foliar fungicides and foliar application nutrients. Oftentimes, those are tools to try to do that. They've not been very effective or consistent for us. And here's an opportunity to look at some new technologies to improve that consistency. That's all I had. That's the two trials and the data that we had from those two trials. I'll be happy to take questions. I'm just like you. I'm trying to learn, and we're trying to look at how these work. Yes?
If you're planting an early variety or early fall,
Right.
are you seeing that that's keeping the stem green longer on picking and delaying picking where you have to desiccate it again? Will this cause that towards the end of the green stem part?
Well, it could. That's a great question. It does use it at early group 4, planting maybe late April or early May, maybe. April 30th. Does that, and of course you're seeing green stem a lot of times at the end of the season.
But the beans are ready the 1st of
Right,
September.
right, but they're still green. And the problem there is they're not loaded heavy enough to take the nutrients out of the daggone stem. And the reason that's happening is at some point those new group 4s saw some stress, a little bit of cold weather early on, or maybe it got hot at some point, and it sort of stressed them. So they delayed some of their pods, so then they don't have the pods load that they really had the potential, certainly, of having on there. Now, you're comparing, and indeed, it leads to green stem. My solution is we got to find a way to load those beans up harder.
Do you think that putting this up there would promote that earlier and help drive that into the bean pod out of the stem then?
Yes, I think there's a real possibility, real opportunity of doing that. Now, let me be clear about what I think you got to use with this technology to do that. I think it's nutrients. You're going to have to use some kind of foliar, particularly potassium-based nutrient, with this technology, get it into the leaf so that that leaf functions to the point where it's building that pod load. Now, if I just was going to use a fungicide in that regard, why, there's always the potential for these fungicides to just keep more green leaves longer in the seed. You may not be able to pick as early. But I think you want to add a nutrient with this in those cases. On those group 4s, you need that energy at podding, and you can't have stress. So nutrients are potassium-based nutrients are your best choice.
And it ain't gonna matter what's in your soil profile.
Right.
What your index is all.
Right,
there.
yeah, it's just not apply more to the foliage, to the leaves that are making the difference, yeah. If the problem in the past, and we've done this, I've tried potassium, foliar potassium, and sometimes I'll get a little response like we talked here, but many times not, and it's because it just isn't getting into the plant. I'm just wasting my trip over the field. I can't get enough of it in the leaf. This technology is the first that I can see where we can actually make that material get in the leaf and function like it ought to function.
Now, do you think that the last few years our weather has been different than prior? You've had a lot of very dry weather, hot,
Right.
and the need for a fungicide has been reduced.
Right, it sure has.
All right, using these higher powered fungicides, I've seen guys, I'm picking beans, I'm not using it, I'm using just a cheap generic,
Right.
small,
Uh-huh.
because I don't see the need for them.
Right, yeah.
I can pick my beans when some of the boys can't,
Right, yeah.
but they're using a high powered
Right,
fungicide.
they're using one
in
that's-
comparison, keeping the stem green.
Stem green, leaves green longer. Yeah, that's exactly what's happening.
So you think, if we were doing the same weather patterns, using a lower fungicide that's not so
Right.
long term, with this nano would help speed that?
Speed that up, growth up. Yes, you're trying to affect the leaf health without affecting and that's the problem with these higher dollar power fungicides, the Veltin, Revitex, they're systemic. So the reason they work is they get in, and then they long now. You really just want something that's going to protect the leaves while you're getting these the flowering and early pod development. That's all you really want. I oftentimes have had a disagreement with when we use fungicides. A lot of them go on at R3. Well, that's the end of flowering, the beginning of pod growth. I think they need to go on at R1. Less likely to affect the green stem at the end of the season, and more likely to be able to affect your pod set at flowering. But yes, I do think this technology offers that promise. It's going to take us some time. We got to get some field trials in with these different approaches to see which one works. And that's why I presented this the way I did, was to try to get you to think about where would this technology be valuable to me. Because I just don't want to, no offense to anybody here about, I just don't want to use it nilly-willy and everywhere. I want to use it where it's most effective, is where I want to use it. Yeah.
I will add to that. A couple of years ago when we were out at the NanoCon conference where they did all their training and stuff, there were a lot of guys from California, Oregon, where they had these management intense crops, and they do tissue sampling almost bi-weekly. And I talked to a lot of guys out there who talked about adding this to the foliar, like
Right.
we were talking about. Much quicker response time
Yeah.
to the plant in regards to coming out of deficiencies or meeting needs. And they wanted to find out, as much as they were using, was it actually working? So they actually were doing tissue samples, like right then, 10 minutes later, 2 hours later. It was impressive stuff.
Yeah, I think this endocytosis, that's exactly what you'd expect. It should get in the leaf quicker, it should get more concentration into the leaf, and last a little bit longer as far as its impact then. Yeah.
Does this work over top of cotton the same way it works with?
Yes, it would work over the same percent.
Worst rate of defoliants.
Yeah, I'll bet that's exactly right. If you think that cotton is a little stressed during that, if you think that cotton's stressed during defoliation, I'd put that stuff in there. It will then knock those leaves out of there. All righty, thanks for your patience.